For 9 seasons, Carroll O'Connor and Jean Stapleton were the heart of all in the family. To fans, they were perfect. But off camera, Carroll said something he never forgave himself for. It wasn't a fight. It wasn't scripted. Just one quiet comment that changed everything. Jean never mentioned it again, but Carroll carried it for the rest of his life. Long after the show ended, long after Jean said goodbye, he still thought about that moment. Now, decades later, those close to him are finally telling the truth. What he said, why it mattered, and why, when it came to Jean Stapleton, it still hurts. To the world, Carroll O'Connor was Archie Bunker, a loud, stubborn, often offensive symbol of a certain kind of American man. But in real life, Carroll was thoughtful, emotional, quietly intense in ways that rarely made it to the screen. And there was one relationship, one person, that reached him in ways few others ever could: Jean Stapleton. She wasn't just his co-star. She was his grounding force. Jean brought warmth and grace to every scene, balancing Archie's brashness with Edith's quiet heart. What the audience saw, their rhythm, their chemistry, their perfect comic timing, wasn't manufactured. It was real. That connection carried them through hundreds of episodes, often under pressure, often with very little time to breathe. But for all their closeness, Carroll carried one painful memory, a moment he never got over. It happened during the later seasons of All in the Family, when fatigue was setting in and tensions occasionally ran high. Not with shouting or scandal, but with silence, with small slips that left a mark. According to a crew member who worked closely with them, Carroll once made a comment to Jean during a break in rehearsal. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't meant to cut deep, but it struck a nerve. The words themselves were forgettable, something dismissive, something rushed. But Jean, who carried herself with quiet professionalism, absorbed it without reply. She gave him a soft look, then continued rehearsing. She never brought it up again. Not once. But Carroll did. He mentioned it weeks later, then years later, sometimes offhandedly, sometimes with a pause. He told a close friend that he wished he'd said something different, that Jean had deserved better, that she was always patient with him, even when he didn't deserve it. This wasn't just guilt, it was respect. Deep, unwavering respect for a woman who rarely asked for credit, but who carried the weight of their most emotional scenes without complaint. And the truth is, Jean's quiet nature sometimes made her pain invisible. She'd arrive on set with her lines memorized, her character fully formed, and never demanded attention. She wasn't flashy. She didn't throw tantrums. But Carroll, more than anyone, understood how much she gave to the show, and how easily it might go unacknowledged. That's what haunted him. It wasn't just the words he said. It was what he didn't say. The thanks he never gave in person. The admiration he never expressed out loud while she was standing in front of him, still in Edith's cardigan, still holding up the emotional heart of a show that had become a national phenomenon. Years later, when Jean passed away in 2013, tributes poured in. Fans remembered her warmth. Former cast members spoke of her kindness. But Carroll wasn't around to say anything. He had died more than a decade earlier, in 2001. And that's what makes the silence even heavier. Because long before the world mourned Jean Stapleton, Carroll O'Connor had already grieved the distance between them. Not a falling out, not a betrayal, just a missed moment, a sentence he couldn't unsay, and a kindness he never got to return. The man who played Archie Bunker never wanted to be Archie. And when it came to Jean, her patience, her grace, he saw the contrast more clearly than anyone. She softened him on screen, and in real life, and yet, in one quiet moment, he forgot to show her the same softness back. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't public, but it stayed with him, and those who knew him best say he carried it. Not like a wound, but like a quiet ache he never got to explain. Carroll O'Connor often said that All in the Family worked because it felt real, not just in the writing, but in the performances. And no performance grounded that show more than Jean Stapleton's. While Carroll commanded attention with Archie's explosive personality, it was Jean who anchored the chaos. Her portrayal of Edith was soft, measured, and instinctively human. And off camera, that same grace made her beloved by nearly everyone on the lot. Their dynamic was never about ego. Carroll respected Jean more than he could express, though that, too, became part of the regret. In interviews, he praised her professionalism. He talked about her timing, her voice, her heart. But those were words spoken to the public. What he struggled with was saying it directly to her, face to face, without performance. Jean, by contrast, didn't need fanfare. She showed up, she delivered, and she made everyone around her better. She wasn't just playing Edith. She understood her. She brought light into a role that could have been reduced to caricature. Instead, she turned it into the emotional spine of the series. Carroll saw it every day. He saw how Jean could shift a scene's entire tone with a glance or a breath. He saw how she never competed for the spotlight, even when she deserved it. And he saw how, when she finally decided to leave the show, she did so without bitterness or drama. She simply said the character had run its course and quietly stepped away from the spotlight. That decision shook him more than he expected. By the time Jean left, all in the family had already begun to evolve into something else. New characters were introduced. The tone shifted. But for Carroll, her departure marked the end of something sacred. The soul of the show, as he later admitted to friends, left when Jean did. And yet, he never stopped thinking about that moment. That single sentence he'd said in haste. That instant where fatigue or distraction had led him to speak carelessly to the person who'd held so much of the show, and him together. He never blamed Jean for leaving. He admired her for it. But a small part of him always wondered, had he let her down? Had that moment, that quiet exchange between scenes, stayed with her too? Of course, no one knows for certain. Jean never spoke about it. She continued to praise Carroll publicly, calling him brilliant, kind, and complex. But silence has a way of echoing. And Carroll's silence, after that moment, after the show, after her passing, spoke volumes. Privately, those closest to him say he became more reflective in his later years. Less concerned with legacy, more concerned with the people behind it. He spoke often of All in the Family not as a success, but as a chapter filled with imperfect choices and deep emotional bonds. He never spoke Jean's name without softness. He never brought up her exit without pausing first. And when he spoke of their time together, it was always with a kind of reverence. Not for the work, but for her. For the way she made him better on screen and off. Carroll O'Connor may have played one of the most abrasive characters in television history, but those who truly knew him understood that beneath the rough exterior was a man deeply capable of love, grief, and guilt. And when it came to Jean Stapleton, that guilt never faded. It didn't come from a scandal. It didn't stem from betrayal. It was the kind of regret that lives in the space between two people who never quite said everything they meant to say. And Carroll, in the years that followed, felt that absence every time he looked back. Because what he said that day wasn't the worst thing. It was what he didn't say after. When Jean Stapleton left All in the Family, the show continued, at least in name. Retooled as Archie Bunker's Place, it kept Carroll O'Connor in the spotlight. The set looked familiar. The voice of Archie still rang loud, but something fundamental had changed. The balance was gone. Without Edith, there was no contrast. No warmth to cushion the hard edges. And fans felt it. So did Carroll. Publicly, he adjusted. He kept the show moving. He even gave powerful performances in those later years. But privately, those closest to him noticed a shift. The joy that once radiated from his work had dulled. The rhythms he'd once shared with Jean, the trust, the ease, the unspoken connection, were impossible to replicate. He missed her, not just as an actress, but as a presence. She had made the long hours bearable, the rewrites manageable, the tension lighter. Jean never asked for attention, but her absence left a silence that echoed through every scene. And for Carroll, that silence made the memory of what he'd said all the more unbearable. The truth is, he didn't remember the words exactly. That's what made it worse. He remembered the look on her face more than anything, the stillness in her eyes, the way she blinked once and turned away. He knew immediately it had landed wrong. He knew she would never bring it up, and she didn't. But from that day on, something shifted. Nothing dramatic, no fights, No distance, just a small, invisible thread that had frayed. He'd meant to fix it, to pull her aside, to apologize, but work got in the way. The days moved fast. The show demanded everything, and then she was gone. That's the regret he carried. Because Carroll O'Connor was never cruel. He could be sharp, yes. He had opinions, he fought hard for what he believed in. But with Jean, he was careful because he knew what she meant to the show. And to him. That's why the guilt lingered long after the cameras stopped. In later years, Carroll became more vocal about his love for Jean. He called her a genius, a rare performer, a woman who never got the full credit she deserved. He told a friend, quietly, that he wished he'd told her more of that when they were still working together. And it wasn't just about that one comment. It was about all the moments he let pass without saying what she meant to him. For Jean, it might not have mattered. She was private, humble, deeply grounded. But for Carroll, the regret was personal. Because he knew, deep down, that he had taken her grace for granted. When she passed away in 2013, the world mourned Edith. Clips circulated. Fans cried. Writers reflected on what her performance had meant to television. But Carroll didn't get to be part of that moment. He had been gone since 2001. There was no public tribute from him. No quote for the headlines. No final words shared in memory of his greatest scene partner. But that doesn't mean the loss wasn't there. Those who knew him say Jean never left his mind. She had been more than a co-star. She was the person who made Archie Bunker bearable, not just for audiences but for Carroll himself. She reminded him of what mattered. She softened the character and the man behind it. And when he thought about their years together, what lingered wasn't the fame or the Emmy wins. It was the moment he didn't get back. The apology he never gave. The compliment he never said out loud. Because for all the words Carroll O'Connor delivered on screen, the ones that stayed with him the longest were the ones he never got to say to Jean Stapleton. As the spotlight faded, Carroll O'Connor's later years were marked by a quieter kind of reflection. The man who had once stood at the center of television's most controversial sitcom now chose silence over spectacle. He rarely gave interviews. He spent less time on stage, more time alone. And those close to him said that as time passed, he seemed to be carrying something heavier than age. In public, he was dignified, calm, almost formal. But in private, those who loved him saw the shift. He had become softer, more prone to long pauses in conversation, more sentimental about the past. And no memory seemed to surface more often or more quietly than Jean. When she left all in the family, he'd said all the right things to the press. He called her irreplaceable. He said the show would never be the same. But in private, he never really processed it. Not the way he needed to. Not the way he would later admit in small moments to close friends or family. He didn't fall apart, but something dimmed. Carroll had already suffered his share of pain. His son Hugh died tragically in 1995, and Carroll fought tirelessly to pass laws to prevent similar deaths. That grief left him permanently changed. But those who knew him best say there were two kinds of pain he carried, one loud, the other quiet. The first was public, etched into courtrooms and headlines. The second was personal, private, tied to a woman he never stopped respecting, and a moment he wished he could rewrite. After Hugh's death, Carroll withdrew even further from the industry. His final projects were chosen carefully, and always with a sense of purpose. But even in his final performances, there was a kind of emotional exhaustion behind his eyes. Not just from age or sorrow, but from the weight of unresolved words. He once confided to a colleague that all in the family had given him everything, and taken more than anyone realized. It had made him famous, yes, but it had also trapped him in a character that didn't reflect who he really was. A character he spent years trying to separate himself from. And Jean had helped him hold that balance. He never forgot how she protected the emotional center of the show, how she endured the heavy themes, the political firestorms, and the awkward scripts with grace, and how she took the emotional blows that Archie threw Edith's way and turned them into something almost holy, something unforgettable. When Carroll thought of Jean, he didn't just see a co-star. He saw someone who had made his life easier, his work better, his flaws less visible. And in return, he wished deeply that he'd shown her the same. He never said it was a blow-up. He never told anyone exactly what he said. But the look in his eyes, whenever her name came up, was enough. It wasn't about a single sentence. It was about all the moments he'd let pass without gratitude. All the days where he assumed she'd always be there, always be kind, always understand. And then one day she was gone. Carroll O'Connor died in 2001 from complications of diabetes, 2 years after his final acting role. Jean would pass away more than a decade later. Their time together had ended long before either of them left the world. But in his heart, it was unfinished. And maybe that's what makes this story linger. Because behind the awards, the reruns, the legacy of All in the Family, is a man who knew, perhaps too late, what she meant. Not just to the show, but to him. He never said it to her face, but he said it to others. And maybe that's all he could do in the end. Jean Stapleton never responded publicly to Carroll's comment. In fact, she never mentioned it to anyone. Not to producers, not to friends, not even to those who worked closest with her on set. If she carried it with her, she never showed it. And maybe that's what made the silence so deafening for Carroll. Because Jean wasn't one to hold grudges. She believed in patience, in compassion, in giving people room to fall short and find their way back. She lived those values quietly, with no need to explain or perform them. So when Carroll slipped, when he said something offhand that landed wrong, she likely forgave him in the moment. But for Carroll, the absence of confrontation only made the guilt heavier. He didn't get scolded. He didn't get a second chance. Life moved forward, but that moment froze in his memory. A missed opportunity to show kindness, to repair something small before it grew larger in his own mind. And over time, that regret grew roots. He never said he was cruel. He never claimed Jean was hurt beyond repair. What haunted him was that he never found the words, and the moment to use them passed before he realized it. He once told a friend that Jean was the only person who could soften Archie without weakening him. She held the emotional center of a show that often waded into difficult, sometimes dangerous cultural territory. When scripts pushed boundaries, it was Edith's softness that made it digestible. When Archie stumbled toward growth, it was her stillness that made it believable. And Carroll knew that. He just didn't always say it. But Jean did know things, even when they weren't spoken aloud. She was known for reading a room without saying much, for watching people gently before responding. She understood Carroll's moods, his need for control, his perfectionism. And she also understood his heart. Their connection was built on trust, repetition, and mutual respect. They spent years sitting side by side on cramped sets, delivering lines that changed the face of television. She knew when he was hurting, and perhaps she knew better than anyone what that regret was doing to him. There are no reports of bitterness from Jean, no recorded moments of tension between them, but there are dozens of quiet stories, of shared laughter, long pauses between takes, knowing glances across crowded sound stages. And those memories suggest something stronger than conflict. They suggest forgiveness, even without the apology. When Jean passed away in 2013, the tributes poured in. Everyone spoke of her kindness, her humility, her unmatched timing. But those who knew Carroll best said he had already grieved that loss years earlier. That when she left All in the Family, something in him left too. And that may be the most devastating truth of all. The greatest things we feel, we often say too late. Not because we don't mean them, but because we assume there's still time. Carroll O'Connor didn't lose Jean in a dramatic collapse. He lost her quietly, in the slow drift of two lives moving forward without closure. A sentence unspoken, a gesture unreturned. But even without a formal apology, those close to him believe Jean knew the truth. She knew what he meant. She knew who he was. And she knew, most of all, that what he carried wasn't shame. It was love, never quite expressed in time. Their legacy lives in reruns, in that kitchen table, in those familiar voices that still echo in living rooms across the country. But behind all of it, behind the history and laughter and controversy, was a real friendship, marked by admiration, imbalance, and a single moment Carroll O'Connor never forgot. and for the rest of his life, it still hurt. Carroll O'Connor spent a lifetime delivering lines that made America laugh, flinch, and think. But the line that stayed with him wasn't one Archie Bunker ever said. It was one Carroll said off camera, to the woman who mattered most on set. He didn't mean to hurt her. He didn't mean to carry it for years. But some moments leave marks even when no one sees them. And for Carroll, the silence that followed was louder than any outburst ever could have been. He never got the apology out. He never found the right time. But in the quiet way he spoke of Jean Stapleton, the way he paused before saying her name, the way he reflected on her grace without needing to be asked, it was clear. He never stopped thinking about her. He never stopped wishing he'd said more. And deep down, where only he knew the weight of that moment, it still hurt. For more emotional stories, check out this video.